I work with so many leaders, and not a single one of them would say that I lack empathy, right? They think that they have the most empathy. They think that they are the greatest listeners. And when I actually have them practice empathetic listening, they fail 100% of the time. And again, not because they're bad people, it's because we've been conditioned to jump in and give the solution or make the person who's having the problem feel less pain, right? We want to help them. We want to move them along. Whereas oftentimes the things that we should be doing is just sitting, listening, asking more questions, going deeper. And it's just not how we've been taught or trained.
Thank you for being here. Welcome to FutureWorks, a podcast dedicated to the conversation around innovation in the workforce space. We're so happy to scrutinize the research, the conversations, what's inspiring us, and really give folks a glimpse into what it is we're building here at Aspect. We get to dive in with guests like Stephanie today and have conversations that will truly help people reinvent the way they show up within the workforce industry. I'm Gillian.
And my name is Michelle, and we're your hosts to lead you through these conversations about what's happening in the world of work and how it can be better. So today, so excited to talk with Stephanie Schott. I think by way of intro, transformation is a very easy word for us to say, but I think it is one of the most difficult things to do unless you happen to be like a caterpillar, destined to be a butterfly. I think you triple that difficulty level when it comes to trying to transform workplaces. But that does not faze Stephanie. She believes transformation at work is possible because not only has she seen it happen, she is the one inspiring it to happen. And not only is she tackling this mountain of a task for companies all over, she is doing it backed by research and filled out with genuine listening and connection. I think this conversation could transform your life. So I went for it there. Let's just get right into it and this awesome conversation.
No pressure.
Yeah, you put the bar real low for me, Michelle.
Low bar. We try to set a low bar here.
Well, this is a low stakes conversation.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. And listen, if we can get 1% there just to inspire, then we've done it.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, with that amazing intro and bar setting from Michelle, let's hear from you a little bit more about your background. How you got started. We know that you've had more than one company in the past. We want to hear about what you're doing now and kind of what you do in your free time. Hint, farmhouse. There's a farmhouse in here, and we know a lot about it because we have the internet, and we don't want you to leave that out.
Okay, good. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me in to have this conversation. It's some of the most important things that we can talk about. It's also something that I don't know why I'm so passionate about it, but I am. So you asked me about my background, who I am. I think first and foremost, I identify as an entrepreneur. You had mentioned multiple companies. I have been obsessed with building things since I can remember. And currently I am building a company called Amplify. And it's kind of an anti-company in a lot of ways. I'm deliberately keeping it very small, very lifestyle-like. I'm based in upstate New York. And despite that, we have a pretty bold hypothesis, which is we can help big companies evolve, transform, whatever we want to call it, simply by helping leaders change their mind. And we do this tactically through executive coaching. And this is a safe space, right? So if I'm honest, I'm an accidental executive coach. And if I'm really honest, for a period of time, I think I may have even looked down on executive coaches as people who may have like tapped out of the work. They couldn't do it. Right. And they were so quick to solve problems with just breathe.
Yeah.
And so I'll say a couple of things. One, I was definitely wrong about the former. Having been in this space now for a few years, like the people that are doing this work are so brave. The other thing is they were really right about the breathing. That does.
There's books on it. There's whole books on it.
It turns out it's a simple answer that is the way forward, but we don't like it because it's too simple, right? We want the harder version of whatever that is. Anyway, so it was at my last company that I actually changed my mind about coaching. And at my last company, Bionic, we were leading these huge corporate transformations for some of the biggest publicly traded companies in the world. And we quickly realized that the McKinsey method, the kind of drop off the answer and collect the check, wasn't really going to work. They weren't listening. And so we pivoted pretty quickly, actually, and we started to use a coaching technique. We started to co-create the solution with them, which was really interesting. We wanted to do the work with them and not for them. We wanted to build the capability and deliberately fire ourselves, which is a really good thing that we didn't take outside investment because
I love the message. I mean,
right? If we went to a company, we're like, hey, we're planning to fire ourselves from our clients in 3 years. I don't know that they would actually put out some money, but we were bootstrapped, so we could do whatever we wanted. Okay, so tactically and technically at Bionic, we were introducing new mindsets, new ways of working that were really grounded in venture capitalism and entrepreneurship. And for context, this was like 2014, 2015. And that was when entrepreneurship really became post-recession huge, right? We had Uber, we had Airbnb, we had these really big unicorns that were coming out into the market. And then on the flip side, we also had venture capitalists, like these cool dudes that hung out in California and maybe did some psychedelics and they invested money and they got a huge return. And this is important because when we stepped into the market, we were going to companies like P&G, Citigroup, like big companies. And I don't know that many CEOs, no, I do know, not many CEOs will sign up for a classic strategic and organizational transformation. They won't do it.
Are we talking ego here?
Kind of. But really, it's because it doesn't work. If it worked, then their egos would be happy. It's safe. And so they're willing to step into it because there's so many unknowns. Right? We're talking huge transformations of business models, not just little products being brought into market. And there's no guarantee that it's going to work. And so to your point, a lot of CEOs stop playing to win and start playing not to lose. And that was a huge problem. And so we needed to reframe this so that they would buy into that. We needed to like literally sneak it onto their desks. And we did this by taking the ecosystem of venture capitalism and entrepreneurship and framing this into what we called the growth operating system. It's a model of growth that you can step into, right? You don't have to do a whole organizational transformation to begin with. But you can step into it iteratively. And by the way, the whole ecosystem is based on the premise of not knowing what the future is going to hold and de-risking your bets, which corporate leaders were not used to doing. They were used to allocating $5 million to the person who spoke the loudest at the meeting, who had the quote unquote best idea. And that is why innovation for so long had failed. So we kind of Trojan horsed it into companies. But really what we were doing is massive, massive kind of classic organizational transformations, which I think is hilarious. And we really just spoke into their psyche of like, don't you want to be the dude in Silicon Valley allocating capital iteratively? And they were like, yeah, we do. We really do.
So good.
I love that. Paint an appealing picture and they will come.
Exactly. And, you know, it's so interesting. Like when I step back and think about my first couple of months at this organization, I'll never forget, I was sitting in a room with a group of leaders. They were the C-suite of a publicly traded company. And we had posited that perhaps they should consider moving from just B2B, business to business, to maybe going direct to consumer. Right? Because again, we have the context of 2014, 2015, democratization of the internet, all of that stuff. And the ensuing argument that happened will never leave. It was hours of deep emotional conversation. And I remember thinking, but we're just talking about a business model shift. But that was a sign that I hadn't really started to understand the gravitas of the decisions that we ask leaders to make. And the reality is we ask leaders to make these monumental decisions that they're company killers, right? They're either company makers or company killers. And in the same way, they're also career makers and career killers. And so when you think about transformation, disruption, all of these big corporate, jargon words, like we talk about how deeply strategic it is and how important it is that we have the numbers and all these things. No. It is so profoundly personal. And that to me, when I got that nugget, when I saw the patterns happen consistently across 42 Fortune 500 companies at leaders of all levels, I was like, oh, this is the thing we need to hit on. This is the thing that we need to change, because even if it's not the growth operating system, right, there's always going to be a new leadership model that we need to ingest and embed and bring inside of our organization. We need the capability to be able to continually evolve ourselves and the people around us. And that is very, very difficult.
It's probably working to your advantage with that approach, that leadership, a new generation is stepping into leadership, and it's a more self-aware generation. So there's like actually more awareness around how they're personally showing up. I feel like I'm curious, not to just dive in, but I'm curious if you have seen that over the last, 5 years even, where the generation in leadership is more receptive to your approach. Are we not there yet?
In the conversation, we're there yet. Are we there yet generationally? Here's what I've learned, because I've taken a look and really unpacked the difference of generations in leadership and in the organization for the first time in the history of companies, which, by the way, is not very long. It's like 100 years old. We've got 4, sometimes 5 generations working together. And I was so excited, right? When millennials stepped onto the stage, the career stage, they were like pushing things and asking for things and challenging the status quo. And then I watched them climb the ladder and get into different positions, and they just kind of melted into the general leadership style that we all are familiar with. And so now I'm watching the same thing happen with Gen Zs. Gen Zs are pushing into the organization. And unlike millennials, they're actually, I think, a little bit more loud. Like they have less to lose in a way. And so they're challenging things like how we craft strategy and make decisions and like really important things. I'm hoping they stay that way. I'm hoping they really maintain that contrarian perspective long enough so that we can create not the Gen Z way, not the millennial Gen X way or the boomer way, but the better third option, the option that's right for companies today.
I feel like the millennial generation was more of a petri dish, because like in leadership within tech companies, for example, because tech companies were booming within the last 10, 15 years, and people were getting roles without proper training or experience leading people. And we were skipping a lot of steps. The director title was thrown around a lot quickly and easily. And it's interesting to watch that evolution, even on LinkedIn, just watching people's career growth.
If I could connect it back to something you just said, which is, do we have the awareness, right? As generations, we're increasing our awareness. I think that is true. And also the challenge is that we're also decreasing our awareness because of.
Yes, yes.
And so I think in a way we have this amazing opportunity, and also we are losing it to the impatience and the addiction to speed and technology.
How do we spot when things need to change in a culture? And do we ever get to a place where it doesn't work anymore?
I think a lot about workplace toxicity, and I think there are so many different forms of it, but the one that I focus is really the result of unchecked mindsets and beliefs and behaviors, that maybe have been reinforced over time. I think I might be an optimist here. I think that not a lot of leaders wake up raising their hand and saying, today I'm going to choose violence, right? Today I'm going to be a really bad person. And I think what this is actually a result of is something that happened way before we were even born. So businesses really only started at like the turn of the century, like 1900s, 1920s, when you had railroads and oil and things that you really didn't want to mess up on. And then you also had, at the same time, a largely illiterate workforce. And so the two things kind of created a need to think about a management style that was going to help predict and control and ensure outcomes. And Frederick Winslow Taylor and a bunch of other academics kind of watched this kind of unfold, right? And Henry Ford is a great example of this. He brought a lot of this kind of management style that was largely grounded in dehumanization into his automobile manufacturing, and it worked. And so the academics kind of put their arms around this and they said, well, this is really interesting. This is working. Let's package this and let's call this an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration, right? And that has been the genetic history of our. So I love that you brought up the fact that everyone got a promotion in the past, like 10 years. So much so that Gen Zs are coming into the workforce today and going, wait, why am I having to wait? Well, the economy 10 years ago was totally different than the economy that we have today. And so the expectations of getting a director title by the time you're 25 is probably not going to happen. But to your point, one of the unintended consequences is we threw people into leadership positions, and the only leadership models they had were antiquated, were grounded in this idea of control, prediction. And what do we know about the world? It is largely unpredictable. It is totally filled with volatility, ambiguity. And so going in with the mindset of trying to control is going to cause, I know, I see research shows a lot of this toxicity. And again, we're not choosing it. Like, think about contextually some of the leadership styles that exist, prioritizing short-term results over long-term impact. We didn't make that up. That's Wall Street. That is the stock market. That's what happens when you have publicly traded companies that have quarterly report outs. But we know that sometimes leaders will take that and they'll make decisions that are not necessarily good for long-term sustainability, but good for the short-term impact. We've got leaders that are addicted to being right? And everyone got to the position that they were in because they had the right answers at the right time. They were rewarded and they were promoted and they were compensated, and our brains were reinforced, right? Oh, having the answers, right. It's good. I should do that. And it's so funny. I work with so many leaders, and not a single one of them would say that I lack empathy, right? They think that they have the most empathy. They think that they are the greatest listeners. And when I actually have them practice empathetic listening, they fail 100% of the time. And again, not because they're bad people, it's because we've been conditioned to jump in and give the solution or make the person who's having the problem feel less pain, right? We want to help them. We want to move them along. Whereas oftentimes the things that we should be doing is just sitting, listening, asking more questions, going deeper. And it's just not how we've been taught or trained.
I'm curious, what does that look like? Asking leaders to practice empathy. What prompts do you arm them with?
Okay, so here's two super easy things that people can practice. The first thing is ask for a volunteer, right? Someone on your team or someone you work with, and say, I want to practice active listening. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to be the listener, and then you're going to be the person that's going to speak. And ask them to think about what they want most in the world, right? A small question. And have them speak for just a couple of minutes. Just talk out loud about the things that they want most in the world. And then as the listener, I demand a couple of things. Number one, you cannot nod. You cannot smile. You cannot jump in and affirm them. Oh, it's okay. Don't worry. No, you have to sit and
oh my gosh,
stone-faced have this conversation. Now, every single time they look at me and they say, Stephanie, they're going to think that I'm not a nice person. And at the end of it, I always ask the person who was listened to, I said, how do you, and most recently, one of the listeners said, I feel like I just made a best friend. That's how far off it is. We think we need to affirm, but what we're doing is we're distracting them from going deeper. We're guiding them to feel a certain way. Another practice, which is super easy. A lot of leaders I work with do not have time, more than 5 minutes, truly, to learn how or practice new skills. And so I love the work by Michael Bungay-Stanier. It's a book called The Coaching Habit, and it's 7 powerful questions. What's on your mind? And what else? What's the real challenge here? What do you want? What's possible? It just goes through systematically the entire executive coaching process in 7 questions. I do this with leaders a lot. And I've had probably 150 people now practice it, and I've watched it happen. And every single time I can see when the person is done with their 3 to 5 minute articulation of what's on their mind, the other person goes, Michael calls it the advice monster. It jumps out and you want to jump in and be like, I have the perfect solution. And I've already warned them that the advice monster is coming in. So they physically retreat back into their seat. And then they ask the question that they hate to ask, which is, and what else? Because we don't want to admit that we weren't listening. It actually feels kind of like we don't get them, right? Or we weren't paying attention. But really, most people come with what they think is the problem, but it's not the problem. And so when you ask, and what else? You'll be shocked at what comes out. You're like, oh my God, I thought I was having a conversation about how your team member is struggling with accountability, but really we're talking about your relationship with your manager.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask, was just how much of it becomes personal versus business in the responses, kind of going back to what you were saying about leadership being personal. I'm curious, like, what the trends are there in terms of how people respond.
Yeah. If I look, and I don't have the data, but I could at some point, and maybe I will do this pretty soon, I would say somewhere along the lines of 80 to 90% of my coaching conversations actually have everything to do with the human being and nothing to do with the business. And it's kind of always been like that. Occasionally people will need, like, hey, do you have a framework? Do you have a model? Do you have something like this? But more often than not, if you're in this position, you already know what you need to do. And people start to struggle when they lose sight of what they have control over. And so part of what coaching is just space for them, which no one has anymore. Space to think and reflect and to ask themselves the question, if this is the problem, then what can I do? And sometimes the answer is nothing. You can't change people around you, right? You can't change always systems around you. Sometimes you have to change yourself. Sometimes the obstacle is the way, right?
I mean, that links directly to the ask of leaders to not respond when their colleague is sharing their answer to that question. Like, sometimes you just have to sit in the discomfort and see what comes of it.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And another example, if it's helpful, a lot of leaders will come to me and say, my team is struggling. Like, they're not doing enough. They're not stepping in. They lack ownership. They'll come to me and say things like, I don't feel empowered. And more often than not, the leader will say, Steph, can you come in and teach them how to think strategically? And I'm like, okay, but let me actually go in and talk to the people, right? So when I talk to the team and where I audit what's happening, and this has happened now several times, so I use this as an example quite frequently. When I audit their meetings, the leader usually is talking like 80 to 95% of the team meetings, as opposed to letting the team members jump in and speak and share and think. And so you unintentionally create this codependency where you're enabling your team not to think and then getting mad when they're not thinking for themselves. And then your team is basically saying, you're not listening to me. So why am I even here? And then they check out.
Yeah. I'm curious. I want to dive a little bit deeper first and foremost, thank you for all this. This is incredibly interesting. I'm curious about culture shifting and the control that we have over it. How to identify when something needs to change, how to change something within your culture when something's not working, and how to not get stuck in like the Kool-Aid cultures that's happening in the tech world, especially. Like, we know that there's a ping pong table, but we don't care anymore because we work remote. Like, cool. I mean, how do we break that? So just want to hear more about culture shifting to you.
So one of the things that I'll always start out with is the question of, are you able to do what you set out to do, right? As an organization, can you actually execute on the vision and mission? And if the answer is no, then the reality is there's probably something happening in the culture, right? Because we use some machines, right? But at the end of the day, it's a group of human beings working together to solve really hard problems. And if they aren't doing that well, then we're not going to be able to succeed as a business. The second question I'll ask people to reflect on is, if you could design the perfect environment where toxicity could thrive, how close is it to your company's? And more often than not, there's just a couple of things that can be allowed to permeate within a culture that can really lower the bar and start to create something called skunking, right? Like, where you have like one bad apple that starts to shift the entire organization. And so oftentimes culture transformation isn't like this big, long, 72 point checklist. There's like 2 or 3 things that you really need to focus on, and you just need to commit to doing those things. And I'll give you a couple of examples that came up recently in the past couple of weeks, actually. So the first is, if you allow something silly, like letting people talk behind the backs of other people instead of giving direct feedback to each other, toxicity will thrive. If you think it's okay to avoid difficult conversations, right? Or you demonstrate that with your team as opposed to facing them head on, that's going to create a toxic culture. And so these aren't huge shifts. They're like these small paper cut things that happen over time that can really drain an organization. And so I say all of this because if you're in a leadership position or not, if you're in an organization and you're thinking, how do I make a change, right? How do I impact the culture? Don't worry about doing everything. Just focus on one thing that's truly going to be a game changer. And then you get to leverage neuroscience. So we have these things called mirror neurons. And when someone acts a certain way, we actually pick up on it, right? Like, we start to almost feel like we're doing that exact same thing. And so if you step in all anxious and stressed out to your meeting because you dropped off your kid and you spilt your coffee and all these things, and you start the tone of that meeting from that place of stress, your team is going to respond by being stressed out because they feel your stress. They're actually living it. And so the same thing is true on shifting cultures, which is the most important thing you can do is show up exactly the way you want to, with integrity, day after day after day after day. And those are the real change drivers that I've seen within organizations. And again, that requires a reminder of our agency. A lot of the times, especially in corporate cultures, startup cultures, anywhere there's more than 150 people, Dunbar's rule, you start to feel like you've lost agency over yourself, like things are happening to you, right? But it's not true. I mean, sometimes those things are happening, right? But it's not categorically happening. And so you've got to parse out, like, what's in your control, what can you influence, and what can you not control? And you just say, okay, I surrender to that thing, right? Mm-hmm. I surrender to the pandemic. I surrender to the economic, right, reckoning that we're in right now. But I can choose how I show up every day.
You mentioned the back channeling and how that's something that feeds toxicity. Such a tangible thing in the world of Slack and other like Teams and all that stuff. I'm genuinely curious because I've been I've been in difficult conversations where I notice that there's got to be back channeling happening around a project because people are fired up about, I can just tell. I can tell that there's back channeling, and I can tell it's affecting the work. It's affecting the drive and the energy around the project itself. It doesn't feel powerful to tell people to please stop back channeling, but that is what you have to do. And that's what I've done. But in the world of tools like Teams and Slack, how have you advised leaders on that?
Yeah. I think it's important to note just generally that we are leading in the age of transparency more so today than any other time in the history of leadership. And whether it's Teams or Slack or text message, whatever we do gets scrutinized, even if it's not on a media outlet. And it's really important because we have to ensure that we're consistent, right? Behaving in a way that is aligned with our values. And the other thing that so specifically on this example that you surfaced, I think is a really relevant one. And I just had this conversation this week, so it's quite timely. More often than not, okay, let's be real. There's two reasons probably why people back channel. One, gossiping feels really good, right?
It's tea. It's tea. It's juicy. It's a break.
We love it. We love it. And I don't know how to change that. So
That's a can't change thing.
Different kind of coach, I guess, for that one.
Exactly. And so on that piece, you have to hold the humanity of people. But on the other side of things, there's a real reason why people start to back channel in a way that's toxic. Because I do think there's like fun tea, and then I think there's toxic tea. And in this particular organization that I'm currently working with, people have been back channeling like crazy. And when I actually did a diagnosis of why it's happening, it turns out that people don't feel safe to tell the truth. Now, what's even more interesting is since Amy Edmondson stepped onto the stage and said, hey, we all need this thing called psychological safety, most leaders kind of perused that HBR article on their way to work and said, it's okay. I don't scream at my team. I'm fine. I create psychologically safe environments. And it's not true. Psychological safety is so much different than that. And I hate that we are even using this term because it's like really what we're saying is like, are we listening to people? So I'll give you an example of a way that this particular leader was causing this like non-traditional, non-obvious psychological unsafety. She was listening. They're in a moment of transformation, as most businesses are. And there's a group of leaders that are leading this transformation. And they went to her and they said, listen, there's some stuff happening. It's not good. We need to face it head on. And this particular leader brushed it off. She met it with a toxic positivity that made them feel like I'm not being listened to. Mm-hmm. And then they gave up. And now they're back channeling to everyone else because they realize that they're currently in a car that's driving off the cliff.
Yeah, the problem has not been solved.
Problem hasn't been solved, and they have to. Their egos are like, how do we manage this cognitive dissonance? We're in the car. We know it's going off the cliff. Well, we're going to just basically talk about how everyone else is not making the right decisions. And they're not wrong in this case. And so this is a really good example of like, sometimes your behaviors, you think like she just wanted to rally them and cheerleader them through this particular moment, but it was the wrong thing. And it's not wrong objectively, it was wrong contextually. And that's where most leaders get tripped up is what got them here won't get them there. And we don't have enough time to really parse out every single behavior or action that we do on a regular basis to say, is this aligned to where I want to go, to the impact I want to have as a leader, the legacy I want to leave behind. And that's why we need space. We do need to reflect. We do need to slow down. And it doesn't mean we're bad leaders, right? It means that we are actually deeply strategic. If we take a moment to journal or reflect about how I showed up this past week.
I love that. We don't all need to have real-time feedback. We can take a pause. We don't need to answer the question on the call. No, that's great. Michelle, you were going to say something.
Oh, I just think that diving into that feeling of not being listened to is like I can see it in like my own self, like the times that I'm like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I'm going to message this other person who also feels frustrated about this. It is absolutely feeling like I have done all the right things. I know this is a problem. And the people who can do something about it are not listening to me. Like that is absolutely in myself. I'm like, oh no, like, oh, that's me. I do that.
And you can see where the advice monster comes back because we place a lot of worth in our ability to solve problems. And we think if we can't solve the problem, then we have to excuse it in some way. But a lot of the times our job is to manage through the uncertainty, the fact that other people around us are going to screw up, and it's okay. We should do what we can in those situations, but we should also give a lot of grace to moments that are not going to be perfect. And instead of looking at them and burying ourselves deeper into the hole, really lift out and just keep going.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about kind of like from the leadership perspective. I would love to dive a little bit into, so what do you do as someone who is an individual contributor in these situations? How do you bring that like authenticity and reflection if, you're not leading other people? Like, where does that fit?
I guess I don't separate individual contributors from leaders. I really think at the end of the day, everyone is a leader. Sometimes you lead yourself. Sometimes you're leading your peers. Sometimes you're leading a team. Sometimes you're leading a function. Sometimes you're leading an organization. But at the end of the day, we have to show up being able to align our beliefs, behaviors, and impact, no matter how big our remit is, right? If you're in an organization and you're an individual, if you are in an organization and you're an individual contributor, you have a huge influence and impact on the people around you.
Yeah. And you're ideally training for what's next. Like you're learning, you're educating yourself and hopefully absorbing. I mean, training feels kind of like a gross word for it, but it is sort of that. Like you're trying things on that hopefully will influence you in another position in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it's not training, maybe it's chiseling the marble statue.
Yeah, we like that better. That's nicer. I'm still thinking about this transparency thing. I don't know if I should name names of companies, but an article came out on Fast Company a couple of years ago that provided me with so much relief. It was a total expose. It was a suitcase brand that's a startup. And it was a juicy piece by a journalist, but it was a piece that needed to be exposed because essentially, I mean, the toxicity in leadership was very severe. And they published Slack communication from the leadership. And the journalist was very much in touch with the individual contributors, if we want to call them that, in how it was affecting them. I mean, how it was affecting their mental health, how it was affecting their time with their families. And I mean, to me, as someone who grew up in startup culture, career-wise, it was highly relatable and somebody needed to do this expose. I'm curious when, like, that is transparency, but like, how do we get the word? I mean, how does that help? Like an expose like that, like how does that help the leadership community in making better choices?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I bet the executive team of that company stepped back and asked themselves a really hard question. I hope they asked themselves a really hard question, really, because at this point, they should be reflecting on how they're contributing to the culture, the conditions that they claim not to want. So the benefit of this kind of transparency is actually helping become aware. Again, I have to believe that executive team did not wake up and choose violence.
Yes, exactly.
I have to believe that they maybe went off course at some point and didn't know how to find their way back, or maybe something was really happening that was uncontrollable. So there's all sorts of contextual kind of situations, but the most important thing that can come out of transparency, and this is why 360 feedback is really important. Feedback of all kinds are important. Is we have to be able to recognize that we are sometimes complicit in creating the conditions that we say we don't want. And that is a hard thing to swallow sometimes. That's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like in this situation, it was a lot of written communications that were affecting people so deeply. And I'm curious how you advise leaders on communication with a team culturally, because reading words hits different than them being delivered verbally. And I do think that would solve a lot of toxicity in workplaces, especially like you said before, being able to pause versus like having a meeting on your calendar in 2 days to deliver something to a team verbally versus spitting it out in a couple minutes while you're on a call on Slack. I'm just curious how you guide leaders in terms of format of communication and how they approach that.
It's funny. I got into a micro argument on LinkedIn about a version of this about a month ago, where someone was arguing that it's really up to HR to come in and help leaders manage their people. And I was like, I don't think that's true. I think it's the leader's job to manage their people. And I don't care how busy they are. That's their job. And so when I see things like poor written communication or off the cuff conversations, I know a lot of things were recorded in the pandemic and shared out of leaders really kind of stepping on it. My biggest piece of guidance for them is to not think of communication as a nice to have or a thing to do in the edges of your job. Your entire job is communication. Your entire job is how you show up to the people around you. And to our point, we know that written communication can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. And it's much better to have a difficult conversation as two human beings than a human being reading words that have been manufactured and edited by either ChatGPT or your PR team or some combination of both.
That's great. That's good to hear.
So the unfortunate piece of that is it means more time. It means we have to slow down and be really intentional, especially in the age of transparency, which just means our jobs are shifting, and that's okay, but make space for it.
The slowdown message, we need that to be amplified across all fronts. I fantasize so much about even the internships that I had when we were just, it was early email, phones, and fax. And it just allowed people to have more time with things. And I'm not even just talking about the completion of tasks. It's communication. It's thoughtfulness that is just lacking in our process. I'm curious, you touched a bit on question-based coaching. Are there other questions that you would arm leaders with to guide their team? Maybe that they can ask doers or independent contributors. How can they kind of follow suit of your coaching approach within their organization?
Oh, I have a whole bank of questions that at some point...
Maybe what are your favorite three? What are your...
Thank you. That's a good one. That's a good one. Okay. So the first thing is, what can I do more of to make you even more successful? And what can I do less of to make you more successful? This goes at like building trust and safety with your team. A lot of the times leaders think they're helping and they're not. So I always like to create the space for that. I stole that idea, by the way, from Laszlo Block at Google. So it works.
Yeah, exactly.
The other question that I got into the habit of asking my team, but then also sharing it with other leaders, is this question: what is one thing that we've done successfully in the past month, and how can we bring that to bear in the next week? And the reason why this question is important is because a lot of us just came from the craziest bull run we've ever seen. And we've had growth on growth on growth on growth, which has really sustained our energy. And winning was a huge dopamine rush that motivated us to really push ourselves outside of the boundaries of what was even possible. Now, we've got a slowdown, we've got layoffs, we've got all sorts of shifts happening. And the biggest impact I'm seeing with leaders and their team is like, my team is not engaged, miserable. They don't feel right, like all sorts of versions of this discomfort. And I point out that, hey, one thing that is missing today that was not missing 2 years ago is the onslaught of dopamine, which, by the way, also comes from things like drugs and social media. And so when you remove all of that dopamine, you go through withdrawal. So you've got a bunch of high achieving people who all of a sudden are not achieving at the same rate that they were. And so you have to train them to train their brains, I should say, to look back and to say, what's good from here? How do we become the masters of our destination? How do we become the best of what it is that we are meant to be, as opposed to how do we win, right? Because not a lot of people are winning right now, but everyone can become better at what they are. And so this is a good question to help them think back on, like, what is it that we're really good at and how do we leverage those strengths in an upcoming challenge? The other thing that I really like to think about for myself is, what is one thing I struggled with in the past week and what did I learn from that? And that question helps me retrain my brain to be really comfortable seeking out uncomfortable things. Because when we can derive something good from something bad, we're more likely to be comfortable with bad. And we need that as leaders. We can't just avoid hard things.
Yeah. And like you said, leaders typically don't like to be wrong. So I think that aligns well. I love this. I love when people start a sentence, anybody in an organization, I love when they start a sentence with, I'm prepared to be wrong, or I'd love to be wrong. And I'm just like, thank you for saying that. You have now leveled the playing field and I get to weigh in. And and also I'm receiving the information differently now. I think that that's a great little leadership hack to try to encourage team members to show like humility, I think.
And there's a great book by Daniel Coyle called The Culture Code, and he talks about admitting when you mess up. Ed Catmull at Disney, when you walk into this big, sprawling, beautiful office that they spent $20 million renovating, he will look at you and say, it was a mistake. We screwed up. We didn't create hallways that were big enough for people to have conversations and not enough space to collaborate. Another good example is actually from the Navy SEALs. And they have a leader there, Dave, that regularly will say to his team, I messed that up.
Yeah, we definitely need more of that. We need to eliminate the fear around communicating failure.
We need to shift our mindset about failure, especially when looking forward, there's a lot more unknowns than there are knowns.
Yeah. I'm so annoying with this one-liner that I say to my husband and my child and myself all the time. And it's not that original, but it's, if you're not, I actually learned it from skiing when I was skiing with a bunch of tough guys in college. And it was just, if you don't fall, you're not trying. And I just think that applies in so many ways. You cannot be better if you're just gliding through perfectly. And it was true because I physically experienced that with skiing, actually. But I love that in corporate environments too. Like, just try, see what happens.
And you know what we don't like to do? That.
We don't like to wobble.
Yeah, we want to be comfortable, right? We want to feel safe because we're not just creating our careers and living our careers for the sake of having a career. It funds our homes and our kids and our future opportunities, and there's a lot on the line there. And also, if we don't push ourselves out of our growth zone, we stay exactly where we are. And oftentimes that's how leaders fail at the position that they're in. It's not because they changed, they did something different. It's because they didn't change. They stayed the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing. This has been so insightful. we do have to let you get on with your day, but I want you to tell us more about how people can follow along, what it is you're up to, how people can access you in case they want to work with you. And after you answer that question, I do want you to give us a quick little spiel about the farmhouse life that you're living.
Yes. Okay. So
we didn't get to that.
On the former, you can find me a lot of places now, much to my discomfort. I'm eating my own dog food. You can find me on TikTok giving micro coaching advice. You can find me on anywhere you get podcasts. I have a podcast I just launched called Mindset Mastery, and that is curated micro meditations and mantras for leaders. And so if you have a moment where you're feeling not confident or stressed out, these have been specifically created for you. We've got an enormous amount of resources online on our website with amplify.com. We've got lots of fun things coming out. We've got a newsletter. You can find us basically everywhere because we are maniacally obsessed with democratizing access to executive coaching. Everyone should have executive coaching from the second they walk into an organization, from the second they decide to move upstate and retire on their farm. So please find me in any of those places. And we've got lots of exciting things happening. We have a new product that we're going to be launching by the end of this year. So follow along for that. And then so you mentioned the farm. So because I do not have any free time, you asked what I did in my free time. I don't. I have no free time. And I also apparently don't like to sleep. I've got a second little business called Ellingwood Farm, which is my 34-acre paradise at the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. And I love to buy and renovate houses. This is a side hobby of mine. And this one, I thought, I need it. I don't know why I need a house this big. And then when I got it, I realized it's because it's going to be a retreat center. And so it serves as a space for leaders, both individually and in groups, to come up and reset. And we've got holistic wellness providers, anything from therapy to Reiki to coaching. And we do guided either guided retreats or self-led retreats, because I really, really think more now than ever, having access to space and time is so deeply important. And especially when you get leaders who are on the verge or are deeply in burnout. And so that's our mission at Ellingwood. I have exactly 4 hours a week to spend on it. So it's still small, but it's growing and it's there. And we love the work that we do. So follow along. We're also on Instagram for that.
Well, you have answered the age-old question, which is, how can I expense my Reiki session?
Classic question.
We've all been wanting that. I mean, that's amazing. And I hope listeners seek you out to book. It sounds like if people are interested in booking time there, Instagram or the website are the best place to go, right?
Yeah, the house has its own website, ellingwoodfarm.com, and then you can find us on Instagram and you can book directly through there.
Awesome. Well, this has been so insightful. I'm inspired. I'm ready to get back to the team and just try to pep them up, inspire them as well. Be open-minded, pause.
Michelle, did we hit our goal? Did we crack the code on transformation? Probably not. But we got 1% there, maybe.
I think the crack is there. And then I already went and followed your podcast. So I'm ready for it to keep cracking at it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, it was such a pleasure having this conversation with you both. And I'm so excited. And I hope to have more in the future.
Amazing. Everyone, thank you so much for listening. Follow along, subscribe, and we will keep you posted on these leadership conversations.